Fantasy, in today's media, is a genre most often wrapped in a late medieval cloak, and there is good reason for that. Anchoring a setting to a given period of history provides a set of pre-existing rules. For the medieval period, we understand this to mean a pastoral, hierarchical, labor-intensive way of life absent certain modern luxuries. We know that electricity has yet to be harnessed, and that gunpowder has yet to be concocted. People carried themselves and their possessions from place to place, or else are carried by sails, oars, or beasts of burden. Wars are fought with bows, spears, and swords, and orders must be shouted over the din. When fantastical and supernatural elements come into play, threatening the status quo and providing better ways to fight, travel, or communicate, they inevitably break these understood rules of the world. And breaking rules is what fantasy is all about. It's fun, but also meaningful. If you were to start from a place without any rules, nothing would mean anything. There would be no context, no reference against which to judge the power and novelty of these new, fantastical elements. We understand how formidable the White Walkers are in the context of the late medieval technology that we see being used to fight them. Similarly, we judge zombies or Decepticons or Godzilla against the power of our own current technology. Reality is as essential to fantasy as shadows are to light. In building their foundation in reality, some fantasies, such as Game of Thrones, restrict themselves to a particular era and locale, in that case, late medieval Europe. Others, however, are more wide-ranging. For Honor, for example, posits a world in which Vikings, knights, and samurai somehow coexist alongside each other. This makes for some interesting and spectacular matchups, but ignores the fact that each of those sets of arms, armor, and fighting styles existed in reaction to the surrounding context of their own place and time. If 9th century Vikings really were fighting 15th century knights, they would very quickly try to steal or buy or make some armor and weapons more suited to the task. The Native Americans, for example, wasted little time in adopting the use of firearms and iron tomahawks, but they nevertheless illustrate that these cultural collisions can happen. In fact, the Mongols were fighting proto-samurai in Japan at the same time as they were fighting medieval knights in Europe. We have, moreover, accepted the coexistence of multiple eras and cultures as a quirk of the fantasy RPG. Different players can choose the aesthetic identities that suit their differing tastes. Barbarians and druids ought to exist in a very different place and time than knights, clerics, and paladins, but we sacrifice these anachronisms at the altar of player choice. Sometimes the brackets extend further back to include Roman legionaries or gladiators, or further forward to include Renaissance-era rapier duelists or conquistadors. Today, we will be looking at the later, late medieval or Renaissance end of those brackets because that is usually where the ships land, and that envelope is often pushed. Despite the existence of armor, ships, and complex hilted swords that in our world would date to at least the 15th century, most fantasies stubbornly maintain that firearms have not yet been invented. This may be an effort, deliberate or otherwise, to impose a firm delineation between these fantastical worlds and our own. In addition, it could be argued that magic fills the void left by the absence of firearms, that there is less of a need to invent guns when people can cast fireballs from their hands. After all, early arquebuses or matchlock muskets, slow, inaccurate, and unreliable as they were, would hardly seem competitive in the face of such supernatural power. Such rationalizations can certainly buy you a couple extra centuries there, so your rogue can have a rapier, and your longswords can have side rings. Occasionally, however, a design creeps in that is so far ahead and so dependent on the paradigm of ranged gunpowder warfare that it cuts through the willing suspension of disbelief like a machine gun cuts through cavalry. In Dark Souls 3's DLC, for example, you can find a jarringly Napoleonic cavalry saber. Baldur's Gate 3 itself, the game that is ostensibly the subject of today's video, has a rapier that, instead of a rapier hilt, is equipped with a symmetrical bowl hilt that would not be out of place on an 18th or 19th century saber or cutlass. And much of the plot of Divinity Original Sin 2 centers around what is, inarguably, at least an 18th century ship of the line. But I would say 19th century, just on the merit of sheer size. At roughly 110 meters long and 25 meters in beam, the Lady Vengeance not only dwarfs HMS Victory, but also the larger and thoroughly 19th century Caledonia class of first rates. Looking closer at the interior, we can see quite a bit of iron bracing supporting the structure of the ship, which helps explain how such monstrous vessels are built in this society, but also places this design quite deep into the 19th century, in our world at least. There is no reason why a gunless society would not eventually build ships this large, using this much iron, but it is extremely hard to believe that a society capable of doing so would not have, at some point along the way, invented guns. And even if magic is more effective than muskets, I do not see it taking the place of naval artillery. The other issue is beam. By the time ships were starting to exceed 100 meters in length in the 19th century, their length-to-beam ratios were also becoming much finer than the 4.4 to 1 that is, incidentally, shared by the Lady Vengeance and HMS Victory. This narrowing was the result of new construction methods, such as the aforementioned iron bracing, combined with technological advancements when it came to hull forms. Ships could then be built that were just as strong and seaworthy as older designs, but with finer lines and narrower hulls that allowed for higher speeds. The Lady Vengeance, then, is constructed like a mid-19th century ship, but designed like a late 18th century one. In either case, however, she is clearly meant to have cannons. From the outside, she appears to be pierced for 70 guns along 2 gun decks, but inside, all we find are another 6 ballistae like those found above deck. The lower gun deck is completely vacant of any armament. Now, these ballista ports differ from the gun ports, or I suppose just windows, displayed on the exterior of the ship. This is one of many minor inconsistencies between the interior and exterior of the Lady Vengeance, but we don't need to be here all day. The ballista ports are not squares, but rather horizontal rectangles, which makes sense given the pivot mounts these ballistae sit on. A gun carriage, or ballistic carriage, on wheels and secured with ropes in the traditional naval fashion, can be angled in various directions through a small gun port, but with this pivot mount, a small square opening would greatly constrict your field of fire. What doesn't make sense is the iron ballista shields, the same as those seen topside, when you're already protected by a couple feet of sentient ancestor wood. To be honest, the ballista shields don't make a whole lot of sense above decks either, and such wanton use of iron continues to contribute to the impression that these people should really have invented guns by now. 6 ballistae constitute a pathetic broadside for such a large ship, and would only really be useful for Kraken defense. That leaves ramming and boarding as the only means of ship-to-ship combat, and while the Lady does have a ram bow, she does not have any built-in ramparts like late medieval carracks did. Or does she? The feature that most confuses me about her is this weird, angled structure full of more gun ports, or windows. This is kind of where the third gun deck should be on a first rate, but the angles are all wrong and it's cut in half by our overhanging ballista mounts. Aesthetically, the only comparison I can think of is to the wooden hoardings built onto the battlements of medieval castles, and while that doesn't really make sense here, it reflects what this design truly is. The Lady Vengeance is a 19th century first-rate ship of the line, complete with fighting tops, davits, gun ports, shrouds strung with rat lines, and so on, but with these over-the-top medieval fantasy elements grafted on top of her. The ballistae, the ornate inlays of the cathedral-like stern, and, of course, the figurehead that speaks, animated by the spirit of the elven ancestor tree whose body has been tortuously hammered and warped into the shape of its own floating prison. This conceptual and visual artistry is truly beautiful, but I wished that this fantasy had been built on a more believable reality. I wish that this art had been painted on a more elegant canvas, something like a caravel or a galleon, not this enormous, industrial-era monstrosity. With that said, let us now examine the ships of Baldur's Gate 3, and see if Larian have done any better at sticking to a late medieval technology level. This may seem unimportant or insignificant, but I stress again that fantasy means nothing unless it occurs against a backdrop of reality. And the realness of that reality is composed of nothing more than millions of insignificant details. Unfortunately, I lack the cultural and historical background needed to comment on the Nautiloid's design, but supposedly the Mind Flayers maintain an empire spanning many of the planes, so we can just assume that they know what they're doing. This seems to be their standard vessel used for interplanar colonization, capable of operating unsupported, though perhaps it could use an escort to help fend off these Githyanki dragon riders. The Nautiloids do have magic purple laser cannons on their foredecks, so they are warships. Like with the Nelson class, this all-forward armament evinces a navy that does not expect to spend much time retreating. The Nautiloids' purposes, of course, do not stop at war, as war is an inadequate term to describe the infection and enslavement of entire worlds. Again, unfortunately, I lack any experience with or knowledge of navigation on the Dark Lake, so I can't really comment on the design of these Dwagar vessels either. I can, however, observe that the connective structure between the two hulls of the catamaran is perhaps struggling for the right to be called a structure at all. The monohull variant seems less likely to fall apart, but it lacks the prominent steering oar on the catamaran that your character even uses. That is nice to see. I don't know what propels these vessels, but it is either the current, some magical force, or a very cooperative wind. These fabric things that could almost be called sails are arranged in such a way that they could only be used as such with a wind from dead astern. But what do I know? I'm just a surface dweller, and as such, I ought to focus my attention on surface ships. Other than the occasional rowboat, the smallest craft we find in the surface world is this lug-rigged canoe. The most interesting thing about it is its steering arrangement. Instead of a tiller, it has lines running to spars that stick out of either side of the rudder. This is a perfectly reasonable and simple solution, and in principle it actually resembles the pedal-operated rudders found on modern sea kayaks. We never see this canoe under sail or even with its sail, although it may be lurking in the background of this loading screen art. More prominent here are the two other types of sailing vessel to be found in this world. A loose-footed gaff cutter, and some kind of lateen-rigged ship, but that one's complicated. We'll get the cutter out of the way first, although Captain Sleem calls hers a sloop, which is fair enough. It is easy to associate the gaff rig with the 19th century, where it reached its peak in usage on everything from Gloucester fishing schooners to Great Lakes cargo barges, but it has actually been around since at least 16th century Holland. And the 16th century does correspond well with our rapiers, if they were rapiers, and the side rings on our longswords. You may, however, be noticing a concerning quantity of iron. Even in the Age of Sail, they weren't using iron for running gear. You need iron for certain things, like anchors, but not for pulleys. You can make those much more cheaply out of wood. I also have my doubts about these metal pegs that facilitate climbing the mast. And there is another problematic theme emerging: the stowing of cargo in extremely inconvenient locations. Overall, however, this cutter is just a light, weatherly, nimble little vessel well suited to navigating confined waterways like the ones we see around Worm's Crossing. If I was teleported into this world, the first thing I would do, after trying and presumably failing to get the hell back to my own, far safer and less tentacle-filled reality, is find work sailing one of these cutters around, because they seem like a great deal of fun. When it comes to vessels that actually deserve to be called ships, there are only two to be found. There are some alarmingly 18th century looking ships in one of the loading screens, but we can pass that off as artistic license. Maybe that's future Baldur's Gate. In the actual game, as is shown as soon as you open it, the merchant fleet of Baldur's Gate observes an uncanny degree of standardization to this one, three-masted, lateen-rigged design. In this loading screen art, we see a slightly different version. The mizzenmast carries a settee sail, not a lateen. But when we actually get to the city's docks, we find two separate designs. The shorter, stubbier one is more like a caravel. Its foremost mast is the largest and tallest. It measures 23 meters long, or 27 meters including the butt spar used for handling the mizzen sheet. I don't know the proper name, but it is historical. And 8 meters in beam. Despite being shorter, the caravel is a deeper ship and probably more seaworthy. One of the issues with it is the mizzen lateen that extends forward beyond the mast in front of it. This arrangement is not impossible, but seems inconvenient. I could be wrong, because I believe in this period they tacked by swinging the lateen around and over the masthead, but who knows. If this is an issue, then a settee mizzen, like the one depicted on the loading screen, would fix it. Everything else worth mentioning here also applies to the other, larger, more numerous design, so let us move on to that one. It is inspired, rather obviously and directly, by the xebec, famous for its use by the Barbary pirates. Wikipedia says the xebec goes back to the 16th century in the Mediterranean, and if that's true, then it's from the same era, albeit from the opposite side of the continent of Europe, as our gaff-rigged cutter. The problem with the xebec in this setting, of course, is that, especially in its later Barbary pirate usage, it was armed with a single deck of guns, much like the frigates and brigs that also existed by that time. Now, obviously, a gunless society is perfectly capable of building a gunless xebec, and as a ship, it is a good design. With a low center of effort and a mizzenmast so far aft, it should be nice and weatherly. Its lateen sails require fewer crew than a more complicated square rig. It is also equipped with oars, as we can see here, which helps with maneuvering in harbors, rivers, or in uncooperative or non-existent winds. This particular xebec has an overall length of 46 meters, a length at the waterline of 33 meters, and a beam of 9 meters. A bit large for the type, but everything is bigger in video games, and those are actually almost identical to the measurements of HMS Surprise, the frigate originally built as a replica of HMS Rose before being refitted and renamed for her fictional role. Zooming in, we find a number of details that are just as wonderfully historical as the overall shape of this xebec. There are anchors raised by a capstan. On the quarterdeck there is a bell, and a plainly visible and clearly functional rudder and tiller arrangement. There are even bilge pumps. As on all these vessels, the ornate wood carvings and gold inlays of the stern are very representative of the medieval period. They loved their bling back then, to a point that we would now consider gaudy or tasteless. So overall, this design makes sense, and I like it, but as you might imagine, there are a few criticisms. Again, we see a preponderance of iron or steel running gear. Again, we have these weird mast pegs. Again, cargo is being stowed in horrible locations. on the quarterdeck, for instance, which is a stability nightmare. We also have an alarmingly 19th century looking deckhouse with an intake funnel that really does belong on a steamship. And the quarterdeck itself is a problem. It should be sloped up toward the stern, parallel with the bulwarks. It remains completely level, however, which means that the great cabin, if there is one, is being scrunched between the quarterdeck and the rising lines of the stern. About half of the transom is above the level of the quarterdeck, which is, quite simply, not how this is supposed to work. Of course, there are always finer levels of detail to descend to, but I've hit all but one of the main points. For my final and largest piece of criticism, I must return to the guns. This Zebek's bulwarks are pierced for 20 guns, and I don't know why. 14 in the Caravel's case. These gun ports cannot possibly serve any other purpose, and without lids they are an active detriment to the seaworthiness of the vessel. They are a mere aesthetic appendix remaining from the historical gun-armed Zebeks that inspired this one. Distractingly and frustratingly, they refuse to be anything else. If they were, instead, the right size and shape to stick these oars through, that would fix two problems at once. But alas, this Zebek has no guns for its gun ports and nowhere to mount its oars. The problem could also be fixed, of course, by just putting guns on the damn thing. In at least one location, conveniently right next to the docks at the steel watch foundry, there's enough industrial capacity to construct a small dockside railway and complex gearing systems for these cranes, not to mention an entire army of robotic law enforcers. The Steel Watch's helmets, by the way, evoke a conquistador aesthetic, and their human colleagues often wear Renaissance-era barbute helmets, so we're definitely looking at the 16th century. The 16th century, I am inclined to remind, is the century in which the Spanish Armada was, as the founding myth of the Royal Navy would have it, defeated by a smaller British fleet only thanks to their superior gunnery. These people have even built a submarine, or as Alondra Gray puts it, a wretched metal monstrosity hewn by hubris. The length of the central capsule, by the way, is 20 meters, and its beam is a whopping 12 meters. That leaves plenty of room inside for transporting passengers, or, as seems to usually be the case, prisoners. This core of the vehicle could be compared to early experimental submersibles like Ictinio II or CSS Hunley. The propulsion system, on the other hand, is large enough and fantastical enough to evade any comparison or criticism. My point, however, is that somebody, somewhere, is mining and smelting prodigious quantities of iron, copper, and other metals. A substance known as smoke powder is even being produced by the barrel. This society, then, really should be able to make some cannons to put into their gun ports. The reluctance to do so, however, is understandable. The sudden appearance of Age of Sail-looking cannons would jarringly upend the pre-established rules of this world. And in fantasy, that is the role of magic, not technology. The unfortunate reality is that, to a modern audience, cannons look 2 centuries newer than the rapiers, full-plate armor, and side-ring longswords that they are, in fact, contemporaneous with. The cannon is, in its original form, a medieval weapon. As such, I would like to see it represented more in medieval fiction and fantasy, to foster an understanding that everything is fluid, that armored knights did not instantly become obsolete the moment a firearm was first discharged on a European battlefield, and that history does not change at the flip of a switch. But if we're not going to have guns, then don't have guns, or anything related to guns. These ships are beautiful and make perfect sense in this world, with one infuriating, irreconcilable exception. Please, Larian, I implore and beseech you, next time, get rid of the gun ports. They may seem like a small detail, but they undermine the reality upon which the fantasy depends.